Hey, and welcome to the Mr. Maple Show. I'm Matt.
And I'm Tim. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to our YouTube channel, and sign up for our weekly emails on Mr. Maple. We love answering a lot of questions for y'all, and we try to do a lot of that through these videos. So today we're going to do a commonly asked question, and that's, why does my Japanese maple have two different types of new growth on it?
Yeah, we're shooting this in August of 2022, and we wanted to get a few different examples on camera and talk to you about the irregular new growth that you can often get late summer. Now, late summer flushes will have a lot of irregularity to them. That juvenile growth can often be exaggerated and irregular, and if it's happening during this time of the year, it's not something you're going to need to prune out and drop off. We have a lot of people who will see this going on with their Japanese maple, and they'll say, something's reverting, it's something happening from the understock. And while that could certainly be a thing, you want to look for what's going on from below the graft. But if you're having irregular sized growth that's all above the graft, that's nothing to be concerned about during this time of the year.
So this is one of our first ones we'll talk about today. This is Acer palmatum Hime Sojo. Now, if you'll notice, the leaves down here, it's a dwarf that's known for having a very small leaf. Some of this new growth flush is very large. And this can happen on new growth flushes during the summer. You can actually have leaves that are much larger on the new growth flush on certain types than they were on the older growth.
Yeah, it's not something you're going to need to prune out. Now, we recommend pruning. Check out our video on pruning Japanese maples. We recommend pruning Japanese maples for shape in mid to late March. Now, you can prune hardened off growth in late summer for size to create a smaller overall plant. You're going to be reducing energy from your plant by pruning during this time of the year. So you can take this out, but it's not something that's necessarily, it's something you need to be doing, because the same branches are going to leaf out next year with nice small foliage. So it's not something that's reverted. It's not something that's going to be influenced long term. It's just that late summer heat causing irregular juvenile growth.
And juvenile growth can be untypical on a Japanese maple. And we're going to talk about a few other selections. This is just an example of how a leaf can be much larger. We're going to talk about a few other selections that'll really confuse people because it's not what they're thinking about when it comes to the Japanese maple.
Yeah, next up here we've got Peve Starfish. Now, this is one of the most commonly looked at ones where people say, hey, my tree's reverting, because Peve Starfish is classically known for having that curled starfish-like foliage. Now, you'll see some of the new growth from this point up has a very flattened out look to it. We actually don't give our trees a lot of nitrogen. In areas where you're getting a lot of nitrogen, you're going to get even more extremes of this. We just have great new growth going on in our 1 gallons right now. So with Peve Starfish, the older growth is going to have that curled effect, where the new growth is going to be a little bit more flattened out right now. So don't trim that out thinking that you have to, because it's not going to come back with the classic starfish. That's one of the ones we probably get the most questions like this about. It's just late summer oddities because it's not leafing out slowly like it did in the spring with that nice cool weather.
And this can be true with Peve Starfish, but that same thing can be true with other plants in that convex category, like Trompenberg.
Yeah.
If they've got that cut down leaf, new growth during the summer may be a little more flattened out, but don't worry, next spring when they leaf out, you should get more of this cut down style that just gives that plant what that tree's known for.
And there's no reason to prune this out because you're going to lose this size. This is already a great size plant. Trimming out all the growth that's flattened out isn't going to help you long term. You're going to reduce the size of the plant by trimming this time of the year, and you're going to lose energy from the plant. And next year, those same branches that had the flattened surfaces on them are going to have nice curled foliage to it when it's leafing out slowly. So expect next spring all these to look a lot more regular. It's also something to point out that new growth is often so large and so irregular that it's the easiest to get a little bit more burn on it. So it's a little bit more irregular, but it's also a little bit more tender when leafing out this time of the year.
And that's too why whenever you're trying to identify a Japanese maple, we often say, look at that older growth. That new growth can be very deceiving. As you see here, you look at this, you wouldn't recognize it as Peve Starfish, but you start to look down here and you notice that older growth definitely looks like Peve Starfish.
Right.
It's not a reversion. It's simply irregular summer new growth. And this happens on a lot of Japanese maples. This is one that we get on a lot, is the Higas styles. This is actually one called Abigail Rose. And you'll notice the older growth has more of the leaf shape.
And a little bit more variegation.
And a little bit of variegation in it that's very typical of Abigail Rose. But you look at this new growth flush, and it pushed a large amount of new growth flush, and it's not reverting. It's simply just putting on irregular summer new growth that will be a solid green most of the time. It's very typical for the Higas types. No reason to cut that out. Next spring when it leaves back out, you should get the reticulation that you're getting on this older growth down here.
Yeah, and that's very true of Yamanishiki, of Eye Candy, of Higasiyama, of Sabi, of many of these styles that have that reticulated Higasiyama style variegation. It's not necessarily something you're going to lose, but by trimming that out, you're going to lose that height that you would have had starting out next year. So Japanese maples are always going to want to throw on new growth. So they can be a little spindly at first, especially in that summer new growth, but I encourage people to be patient and let that slow down and leaf out the next year more regularly.
And remember, Japanese maples change colors throughout the seasons. Just because you're not seeing that pink and white that you saw in the spring on these Higasiyama styles doesn't mean that you're not going to see it again next spring.
And that's very true for just green types too. So if you're looking at many different Japanese maples, you'll see irregularly shaped growth going on. And I'll get people messages and they'll say, look, I've got a sport, I've got a broom started, I've got something unique. And I always encourage people to continue to watch things because you never know, things always happen. But typically it's just irregular summer growth. So this time of the year, expect some weirdness on your foliage.
Now, the only style that I know of the Higasiyama styles that does revert is Iro.
And they're supposed to.
And their name means different, and that's because they're supposed to put on, in the springtime, green leaves and the Higasiyama style. Yeah. So that's the only style of that style that could possibly revert. And then you want to check it out in the spring and try to balance out the reversion and the Higasiyama style in there with it. But this plant does not revert, so you don't have to cut this back every spring. I've seen some posts online, people saying, I've cut my Higasiyama back every spring because it puts on the summer new growth.
Right.
And that summer new growth is never going to be variegated. That's not the characteristic of this plant. Its characteristic is going to be green during the summer on that new growth, and then next spring you're going to get that reticulation coming back.
Yeah, I encourage you to be patient. Leave that for next spring. Now the next one up here we'll talk about, this is Punkil, but what I'm going to talk about for this is indicative of any of your lunar lobulum types. So this could be Koto no Ito or Biniotaki, any of those. What you'll often see is the thin strap leaf foliage on the older growth with then much larger foliage on top. And it's one of the most commonly asked ones where people say, hey, I saw my lunar lobulum here is reverting and they've trimmed the growth out and all you've done is robbed yourself of that new growth for next year. So be patient with that. This growth is going to come back next spring and be the same size when it's during this late summertime. Now, I'll give you a little tip if you're a grafter and you grow Japanese maples. We actually graft all of our lunar lobulum styles onto Acer palmatum subspecies palmatum, which is a small leaf green. By grafting something like an Osakazuki style leaf, that large Amoenum style leaf, you can create more reversions of this. But if it's properly curated in the way it's been produced, there's no need to be pruning the growth out.
And like Matt's saying, the new growth during the summer that is large, it looks almost like a typical red Japanese maple, is typical for red lunar lobulums. It may be a little bit wider on greens as well, and that's very typical for green lunar lobulums like a Koto no Ito. Not uncommon for that to happen during the summer new growth flushes. Now, if you see that in the spring, tag that. Then check it out the following year. If it's done it again in the spring, you may need to prune that out because that could be a reversion. But the summer growth, new growth flushes, this right here, it's almost mind-blowing that this next year will come out to look like this. I mean, it doesn't make sense.
Especially if it's all just at the top like this and you have smaller, older growth, it's very likely that summer new growth flush. Now, again, we're shooting this in August, so that may be very different when you're seeing that same thing in April. That would be a different issue there. But in August, that's perfectly normal new growth, and don't rob yourself of that new growth. Let that growth harden off and form for next spring. It's all going to come back with that nice style, smaller foliage like you wanted. And you're just going to have a smaller tree long term if you chop it back.
And remember, new growth flushes can have different colors on it than old growth. One of the things we're not talking about here is this coming from the rootstock? Is there a growth coming from the rootstock? If you want to check more of that out, check our video on why Japanese maples are grafted. And we talk a little bit about why Japanese maples are grafted, what they're grafted to, and how to watch out to look for rootstock popping up on your plant. So that's a completely different topic than this unusual summer new growth. So do check that video out if you're seeing a green popping out at the base. That may be what you're seeing going on.
Hey, I hope this answered some commonly asked questions for you. It's something we certainly see a lot in email, and I hope this gives you more confidence in gardening with Japanese maples. Our purpose here with this channel is to make it easier for y'all and, just to give you more confidence in maples. This may be something that might have looked irregular to you, and it would make sense why it would, but it's not something to be worried about, especially on something like Trompenberg or Peve Starfish or Koto no Ito. These are late summer flushes that are going to be juvenile, but that juvenile growth is going to be affected by that heat. Now, as a cause, this is often some of the most burned foliage on a plant. So sometimes it'll leaf out with a new growth push, but that growth, it's not quite ready for that summer sun. So be patient with it as well. You'll have some buds back there, and then next spring you're going to have way more regular style foliage in that same spot.
And I hope this helps you understand a little bit about the nuances of Japanese maples.
And how they grow.
And how they grow, because the summer flush can be very different from the spring flush. I mean, Japanese maples, they change throughout the entire season, and that's one of the reasons we love Japanese maples.
It's one of the hardest times to identify for sure. We get a lot of questions like, hey, what maple is this? And we're like, you're gonna need to let that slow down and show it to us in spring or fall. Preferably both. We get a fall idea of what the color is and spring, because we can kind of give you an educated guess, but oftentimes that summer regularity is gonna throw it off completely.
Yeah, most definitely. So I hope this helped you understand what may be going on with some Japanese maples in your garden. Make sure to share this video with your gardening friends. They may be coming across these same questions about summer irregular growth on Japanese maples.
Take care.
God bless.
And have a great day.